This is China. Here are glistening cosmopolitan cities. Great ports teeming with traffic. New apartment houses. Slick cafes. Factories to make everything a country needs. Here, too, are modern schools. Hospitals. And laboratories. This is China, but it's no longer Chinese. For 7 years, it's been part of the Japanese Empire. This, too, is China. This is free China, where the fight against the Japs continues. Little has changed here since long before Columbus discovered America. These rice paddies have been irrigated this way for centuries. The wooden plow and water buffalo are almost as old as the land itself, where the eternal fight for food is as bitter and hard as the struggle against the invading enemy. Malaria, dysentery, and cholera plague the people. Into this primitive country, Americans came to fight with the most modern of weapons, air power. This is where General Chennault and the Flying Tigers of the 14th Air Force have forged one of the most amazing links in the chain of American air power that now stretches around the world and is strangling the Japanese Empire. The 14th fights a long way from America. To understand its achievements, you must consider its peculiar problems. Everything you see here, every piece of machinery, every American soldier, every drop of gasoline, and every bullet and bomb has been flown into China. Everything the 14th uses, from paper clips to blockbusters, comes from America over a supply line that's unbelievably difficult and complicated. To make it simple, we'll start from the docks of Calcutta and ignore the 10,000-mile convoy trip it takes to get there. Calcutta is the second city of the British Empire, a seaport whose docks should easily accommodate our shipping. From Calcutta, supplies travel 600 miles north to air bases in Assam. Here are acres of jeeps stored in a Calcutta park, all destined for China. Destined doesn't mean arrived. Warehouse facilities are jammed and the overflow lies in the open, exposed to burning sun in the dry season, drenched in torrential rains during the monsoon. All these vehicles and equipment await shipment north. But there's no single road to Assam. You use ox cart, truck, river barge, railroad, and air transport, and in no set system. What moves by rail today may be reduced to river barge tomorrow. These barges on the Brahmaputra River take 40 days for a single journey. The Assam-Calcutta Railroad was not built for heavy traffic. In peacetime, it hauled the tea crop to the docks and carried planters' supplies back to Assam. Now it carries heavy supplies for British, Chinese, and American armies in Burma, in addition to materiel for the 14th in China. China waits for this equipment, but the equipment waits for freight cars, and waits, and waits. Ammunition rusts, and rubber hose rots while the 14th Air Force patches and waits. Broad gauge track begins to disappear 180 miles north of Calcutta. The time-consuming transfer to narrow gauge trains begins. Not even a box of K-ration can be shipped from Calcutta to Assam in the same car. This electric crane can transfer heavy equipment. Unfortunately, it's the only one on the line, and a bottleneck. 5 hours is the average time for 24 drums of gas to move from broad gauge to narrow gauge boxcars. Even tank cars have different capacities, and their contents have to be transferred. Here is the last inch of broad gauge track. Trucks are transferred here by laying planks between the cars and driving the trucks across from broad gauge to narrow gauge. That at least is simple, when there are no accidents or derailments. These ferries across the Brahmaputra are the last bottleneck along the line to Assam. One carries personnel and the other rolling stock. Cars are pushed aboard and in less than an hour are on the far bank. They unload again and are off to Chabua. 300 miles away. 26 hours by the fastest passenger train, and days by freight, if all goes well. At Chabua, things begin to pick up. The airport and its satellite fields is the great hub of activity in Upper Assam. Here, freight is unloaded, inspected, classified, and stored. But all China has to fight on these supplies. Only a fraction goes to the Flying Tigers. Here is the precious fluid for the 14th fighters and bombers. Here are the 300, 500, and 1,000 pounders that the Flying Tigers will deliver to the Japs. Everything that can be crammed inside the fuselage of a transport is flown across the hump to China. Even a primary trainer. The hump. 500 miles of the worst flying country in the world. Everything's been easy up to now. As you climb up off the field at Chabua, you can see the dead end of India sealed off by the 16,000-foot ridges of the Himalayas. You have to top these peaks to get to China. To the north, the snow-covered Tibetan peaks, rising up to 25,000 feet. To the south are the Japs. Below, barren, frozen wastes and jungle-filled valleys inhabited by headhunters. There's no summer on the hump. Snow always crowns the peaks. Ice hangs heavy in the clouds. Black monsoon storms sweep up from India, screening the peaks and bringing terrific turbulence that has flipped fully loaded transports on their backs. The worst up and down drafts in the world slide around these slopes. Jap fighters from Burma prowl the hump, looking for easy game. There is heavy toll on freight for the 14th. Casualties among transport groups flying the hump are higher than many bomb groups sustained in combat. Many a cargo destined for China is rusting on these peaks. It's a tough job delivering the goods to China. 4 hours of sweating it out each way. Looking for Japs if it's clear, and taking your chances with the weather if it's not. Then finally, you break out over Lake Kunming, nestling in a broad valley 6,000 feet above sea level. You let down into the gateway to free China, the home of the 14th, and the back door to Tokyo. This is the end of the line for the hump pilot. He goes back to India for another load, and the 14th takes over. Kunming was the first base of the 14th. One of the first jobs of its pilots was to defend their airfields and keep the hump route open. Here are some of the men who did that job. They are the original Flying Tigers of the American Volunteer Group. Former Army, Navy, and Marine pilots who came to China as civilians on a strictly business deal. $500 a month salary and a $500 bonus for every Jap plane destroyed. In the 5 months after Pearl Harbor, they got 300 Jap planes and lost only 12 of their own pilots. From these original Flying Tigers, the newly organized 14th Air Force got planes, pilots, insignia, a commander, and a great tradition. The planes were battered P-40s with 30 caliber machine guns, museum pieces on any other front, but all they could get in China. But the pilots were battle-wise veterans who now joined the Air Force as majors. The commander was the retired Army captain who led the Flying Tigers, now Brigadier General Claire Chennault. With this motley array of men and planes, he faced a ring of Japanese air bases from Upper Burma to Indochina, prepared to keep the aerial supply line over the hump open. Small wonder the Japs thought they could blast these Americans out of China. The stakes were high when they tried. If they knocked out the Air Force, they could close the hump. Without the hump, China would be cut off from the Allies and virtually out of the war. Again and again, the Japs sent big formations of fighters and bombers against the American air bases around Kunming. Day after day, the red air raid warning balls went up, and the pilots scrambled for their shark-nosed fighters. Jap bombers bored in. Shark's teeth flashed to attack with General Chennault's famous fighter tactics. But enemy losses were so heavy that the Japs were forced to give up their attacks. With the hump bases safe, General Chennault planned to move into East China and take the offensive. With the help of the Chinese, the 14th was free to kick open the back door to Tokyo a little wider. The first jump was 400 miles east from Kunming to the Hengyang-Luzhou line, with major fields at Hengyang, Lingling, Guilin, and Luzhou. 250 miles closer to the Japs were the staging fields of Sichuan, Quanzhou, Namyang, and Nanning. From these new positions, American planes could attack the Japs along a wide arc from Shanghai to Saigon and as far east as the Philippines. Nowhere else in the world in the spring of 1943 could American air power strike so close to the heart of the Japanese Empire. You are seeing a miracle. In less than 3 months, these people built a chain of airfields that could handle the biggest American bombers. They built them on the land that formerly raised their food. They built them by hand. Their pay was 20 cents and a bowl of rice a day, and the Japs the American planes would kill. As many as 90,000 people worked on a single field. From 8-year-old children to 80-year-old patriarchs. And women worked as hard as men. Each field posed a different problem. Here, rice paddies were drained. There, a river diverted from its course. Hills were leveled. These cones of earth measure the depth the workers dug and serve as the basis for their pay. These rocks were carried from a riverbed 2 miles away. The large rocks are laid by hand and form the runway foundation. Mortar of mud and water, called slurry, is mixed and poured over the foundation as binder. More stones are crushed and spread over the foundation to make the surface. More slurry is poured, and the stones are covered with sand. Half-ton rollers pack the stones. Add a ring of revetments, and you have an airfield ready for action. The Chinese air raid warning net kept American planes from being caught on the ground. Chinese spotters, farmers, soldiers, magistrates, covered all territory between our bases and the Japs. They flashed word of enemy air movements by telephone and radio. If a Jap bomber warmed up on a Canton airfield, word often reached this fighter control cave at Guilin before the plane could take off. The net also guided lost planes, and Chinese guerrillas saved many American pilots and crews who had to bail out behind the Jap lines. No American stood guard, cooked, or carried. They built our quarters and did our housekeeping. Many Chinese with technical training joined the ground crews and helped keep American planes and equipment working. New American planes reinforced the battered P-40s and the dozen B-25s that were the bomber command. Long-range B-24s, cannon-carrying B-25s, and some P-51s. The American squadrons were joined by pilots and crews of the Chinese-American wing. These Chinese airmen had been trained in America and now returned to their own country, ready for revenge. But the 14th was still the smallest American Air Force and lived on a starvation diet of supplies. It took almost all the increasing hump tonnage to keep the new planes supplied with gas, bombs, and bullets. B-24s supplied themselves, flying 4 supply missions across the hump for every combat mission they flew against the Japs. This plane would be junked in any other theater. In China, it is patched with parts from other wrecks and sent back to fight again. There is firefighting equipment that would have saved the life of this pilot, but it would have displaced a 1,000-pound bomb or 200 gallons of gas in the precious hump tonnage. These are the grim choices the 14th has to make. This is the hard way to refuel. Modern gas trucks and pumps couldn't squeeze through the hump bottleneck. Gas for motor fuel is diluted with 75% alcohol, made in China. It's hard on the motors, but it saves hump tonnage. All this gas meant scores of dangerous hump trips and took weeks to accumulate. All of it was burned up in a single mission of one heavy bomb group. This was also burned in the single mission, a Jap mission. 15,000 gallons of gas and oil went up in this blaze when Jap night raiders hit a supply train at Luzhou. Probably the best way to explain the shoestring on which the 14th operates is to realize that everything delivered to it over the hump during the first 6 months of 1944 could have been carried in 5 Liberty ships. New supply problems were created by the move to East China. High-priority cargo still moved by air. But the bulk of supplies moving to eastern bases traveled in another patchwork system of trucks, a rheumatic railroad, and these streamlined carriers. Even Christmas came late to East China. It was March when these Christmas packages from America and Santa Claus reached Guilin. The Flying Tigers had to do the most with the least. One bomb in China had to do the work of a dozen elsewhere. To do that, you go down low and ram it home. Like that. That was practice. By the fall of 1943, the 14th was punching the Japs from Indochina to Formosa. Shipping was the main target. The new bases brought the Japanese lifeline within easy range. This lifeline was the sea route from Japan through the Formosa Straits, down the South China Sea, to the Dutch East Indies, and the Southwest Pacific. Oil, rubber, tin, and other raw materials moved north to Japan. Troops and supplies moved south to the Pacific fighting fronts. As the Navy moved westward across the Pacific, more and more Jap shipping was squeezed into the China Sea. The 14th's hunting grew better. Every type of plane the 14th had joined the attack on Jap shipping. Fighters dive-bombed, skip-bombed, and strafed. B-25s came in at mast height with cannon fire and bombs. B-24s bombed the ports from high level, smashing docks, shipyards, and warehouses. Hong Kong was one of the targets. Jap shipping losses mounted during the fall and winter. 40, 60, and 80,000 tons a month went down under the guns and bombs of the China-based planes. Specially equipped B-24s prowled the sea lanes at night with new tactics. In 6 months, they sank a ton of Jap shipping for every gallon and a half of gas they burned. This crew sank a Jap cruiser with only 5 500-pound bombs and has accounted for 58,000 tons of merchant shipping. As a result of these attacks, the Japs realized that they had to drive the 14th out of China. 3 times they tried to knock the Americans out of their eastern bases. Here's where the first attack started. In the spring of 1943, the Japs drove south from the upper Yangtze. In the summer, they tried an air blitz. In the fall, they were back with another ground offensive around Tungting Lake. Each time, the combination of Chinese troops and American planes hurled them back with heavy losses. In the spring of 1944 came the Great East China Offensive. 200,000 Japs poured down from the Hankow Bulge. Another 50,000 pushed north from Canton to squeeze East China in a gigantic pincer. Their objective was to drive the 14th out of China, gain control of the Hankow-Canton Railroad, and fortify the China coast against the threat of landings by the American forces pushing westward across the Pacific. The 14th attacked with every weapon in its arsenal. Despite bad weather, fighters strafed troop columns with rockets, frag bombs, and machine guns. Many cavalry columns spearheading the drive were broken up by strafing and bombing. All this cost American blood, as well as gas, bombs, and sweat. Pilots flew 3 and 4 missions a day for weeks without end. These Jap prisoners taken at Hengyang were thin and half-starved. They said no rice and little ammunition had reached them for weeks because of air attacks. American bombers and transports dropped supplies to the Chinese garrison by parachute. 1,000 Then the 14th ran out of gas. Some fields had no gas. Some had just enough for one more mission. At others, gas was pumped from bomber tanks to keep the fighters in the air. Before enough gas reached the advanced fields, the Japs had surged over Hengyang, never again to be halted until they had split free China. The great retreat was on. One by one, the airfields that the Chinese had clawed out of their precious rice paddies with their hands were mined and made ready for destruction. China. Some were burned by the Japs, some by the Chinese as they slowly retreated. After 7 years of war, this was the face of China. On the last day, runways were blasted by 500,000-pound bombs. One by one, the bases were destroyed. Hengyang, Lingling, Guilin, and finally Luzhou. The headquarters safe was removed. And the flag came down at Luzhou on the afternoon of November 7th. Combat crews packed their luggage in B-25 bomb bays. Carrying 10 to 15 men, the Mitchells took off from Luzhou for the last time. A few hours after these pictures were taken, the runways were destroyed. The Japs were only 20 miles away. In the wake of the Jap advance, a tide of homeless Chinese flowed along the long and bitter road to Kunming. Chaos and suffering defied description. When these pictures were taken, 80 trains waited to be routed westward from Luzhou over a single track. 100,000 refugees jammed the railroad yards, waiting with their belongings for a train to carry them to the safety of the Quail Plateau. Sanitary conditions were horrible. They slept, ate, cooked, and washed as best they could. Doctors' cholera epidemic if they were not moved quickly. Also waiting to be shipped were thousands of gallons of gasoline salvaged from the abandoned airfields. The few remaining guns of the Chinese army, American ammunition, tools from a machine shop, even railroad ties, all took precedence over the people. A captured Jap Zero was shipped back for intelligence examination. Meanwhile, the refugees clung to hope and waited. Some, considered lucky, fled by trucks, stinking charcoal burners. alcohol burners that had to be warmed and pushed to start. A truck carrying American belly tanks mingled with the mob. The road was lined with broken down trucks. Many were stripped of parts to keep others going. The only way to stop runaway trucks without brakes was to run them off the road, where many of them stayed along with the equipment they carried. Most of the homeless horde inched their way on foot, with all their belongings in the bags dangling from poles. Beaten and weary Chinese soldiers mingled with the civilians, many of them without either rifles or shoes. They carried sick and wounded on bamboo stretchers. Farmers and soldiers combined to carry much of the rice harvest beyond the reach of the enemy. Jap 5th columnists helped spread panic. All over eastern China, these scenes were repeated throughout the blistering summer and wet, muddy fall. Here was a people again uprooted, repeating the scenes of 7 long and horrible years of war. These refugees had long been a favorite target for Japanese pilots. But during this long trek, Jap airmen declined to venture into American-held sky by day. No Chinese were killed by strafing or day bombing. General Chennault ordered special fighter patrols over railroad yards and other congested areas when Jap air attacks seemed imminent. None came. Prices rose to 500% of the already inflated values as food and shelter became scarcer along the way. Tiny villages mushroomed into teeming cities of bamboo and banana leaf huts. As the road wound up into the Kweijo Plateau, some were literally on their last legs. Many of these people were captured by the advancing Japs. Others were waylaid by bandits in the hills. Along the road to Kunming, refugees streamed past new airfields that thousands of other Chinese were building to give General Chennault's flyers new springboards for attack. In Burma, crack Chinese divisions were loaded into transports and flown to the crumbling East China front. They had American artillery, bazookas, mortars, machine guns, and plenty of ammunition, and had proved they knew how to use them in driving the Japs out of North Burma. Colonel Luke Williamson's flying coolies rushed other fresh troops from Chungking to the threatened area. The Japs were within 20 miles of cutting the Burma Road in China and overrunning the new American fields when these veteran Chinese troops, supported by air attack, hurled them back 60 miles off the Kweijo Plateau down into the valleys of East China. The Japs had started out in May to take the Canton-Hankow Railroad, occupy strategic coastal areas, and knock the 14th out of China. When they were checked in January, they had the railroad and the strategic areas, but they had failed to knock the 14th out of China. Even while they were fighting to clear China of the 14th, the Far Eastern Air Force and the Navy bombed the China coast from the Pacific. Their attacks were echoed by bombs from China-based planes hitting the same targets. The Japanese lifeline was caught in a vice of American air power, stretching around the world. More supplies reached the 14th as the first convoys traveled the Lido Road, opening the first land supply route to China in 3 years. From new bases all over China, the Flying Tigers renewed their offensive. And the Japs well knew what the relatively few planes of the 14th on their China flank could do. This is what they have already done. Destroyed 2,000 small supply boats and hundreds of locomotives, trains, vital bridges, supply dumps, and barracks. Destroyed 2,500 Japanese planes. Killed 35,000 Jap troops. Sunk and damaged 1.75 million tons of Jap merchant shipping. That was the work of the Flying Tigers. Work that is just beginning.
In March of 1985, we traveled to Titusville, Florida, where members of the Flying Tigers were the honored guest of the Valiant Air Command at their annual air show. Friendships formed over 40 years ago were joyfully renewed. The dedication and love of country and humanity which inspired these men was still evident. Like the rest of the world in 1940 and 1941, they had watched the newsreels and listened to the news of Japan's invasion and bombing of the helpless Chinese people. So when an offer was made for pilots to fly in China, they were quick to volunteer. They're ready to fly and fight the invaders who, unbeknownst to any, were soon to threaten our own country. These Navy, Army, and Marine pilots joined the American volunteer group to help fight the good fight, repulsing unfair aggressors of the Chinese. Even though they were well paid for those times, several of the Tigers told us that it was not a factor in their joining Claire Chennault's group. They simply wanted to engage the enemy and help stem the tide of the Japanese invasion in China. Yes, these are very special men of great talent. Claire Chennault, Pappy Boyington, Tex Hill, Bob Prescott, who later went on to form the Flying Tigers Airline, and among the many others, Rhodey Rodewald, who in 1983, though confined to a wheelchair, completed a solo around-the-world flight in his single-engine Piper Comanche.
I'm R.T. Smith. I was in the American Volunteer Group, which became known as the Flying Tigers, of course. I had been trained and learned to fly in the Army Air Corps in 1939 and 1940. Was commissioned in June of 1940. And then I went back to Randolph Field to be an instructor in basic flying for about a year, at which point in June of 1941 I heard about the Flying Tigers being formed. Only then it was called the American Volunteer Group. So I resigned my commission and joined up with the AVG and got over to Burma in September of 1941 and joined up with the other people who had gotten over there by various means, different boats and whatnot. And we trained a while in Toungoo, Burma, which is north of Rangoon, about 150 miles.
The new fighting force would officially be named the American Volunteer Group, the AVG, but their existence was kept top secret.
Many of the Chinese generals still believed that the salvation of their country was the proper deployment of their marching army. In early 1942, the Chinese were still employing World War I fighting techniques.
We got into our first action with the Japanese in December, late December. First actual fight that we were in down in Rangoon was on the 23rd of December, and then again on the 25th. And those turned out to be the two biggest Japanese air raids that took place during the entire war in the Southeast Asia area.
At 9:30 a.m. Christmas morning, the alarm sounded. An armada of 60 bombers escorted by 20 fighters were on their way to Rangoon. The Tigers launched to meet the enemy. 10 miles from the field, the Tigers met an awesome sight: 80 Japanese aircraft. As they approached the Rangoon River, the invaders split into two groups. One headed for Rangoon, and the other bent on destroying the Tigers' base, mingled on Airdrome. The Tigers dove with guns blazing. Within moments, 5 large bombers were in flames and falling, while others hurriedly dumped their bombs on the rice fields and took off to the east. They had had enough of the crazy men with their snarling, shark-faced aircraft.
On those particular days, we got about 14 P-40s up on the 23rd, and I think 13 on the 25th. And the total score on those 2 days was about, I believe, 28 Japanese airplanes that we shot down, and we lost 5 of our own airplanes, but only 2 pilots. One of them bailed out okay, and 2 others crash landed in the rice paddies after their airplanes had been shot up a little bit, and 2 were shot down and killed.
Let's examine the aircraft flown by the Tigers and the Japanese. The basic design for the P-40 was conceived in the mid-30s as the P-36 or Curtiss Hawk Model 75A. A few of these radial engine Hawks were flown by the Tigers just before being disbanded in 1942. Curtiss, using this basic design, added a 1150 horsepower Allison engine, which boosted the top speed to 345 miles per hour with a cruising speed of 240 at 55% power. The P-40Cs, as flown by the Tigers, could obtain an altitude of 25,000 feet. The Tomahawks supplied to the Tigers were the export versions of the P-40C model. The only difference being the export version had 2 50 caliber guns in the cowling and 4 30 caliber guns in the wings. This was the same armament as the P-40B. The English version of the P-40C model carried 6 30s in the wing with no cowl guns being used. The Tigers liked this arrangement of guns, plus the super stability of the C model. It was almost impossible for the aircraft to be spun, so that the pilots could really throw the airplane around the sky without fear of falling off into an altitude-robbing spin. The C model also had a very rapid roll rate, which the Tigers would use regularly for their victory rolls over the field after a successful mission. From March 1942 to July of 1942, the Tigers received 30 Curtiss P-40E Kitty Hawks. The new aircraft had 6 50 caliber wing guns with provisions for either an auxiliary gas tank or a 500-pound bomb slung under the fuselage. A slightly more efficient Allison engine and a cleaned-up airframe increased the Kitty Hawk's speed about 15 miles per hour. But these changes in the airframe and armament also caused a negative change in the handling characteristics. The Kitty Hawk would spin and became very heavy in the controls at high speeds. But on the positive side, the new aircraft was better suited for the increasing ground support role that the Tigers found themselves performing. It was here that the added punch of the 650s and 500-pound bomb were really appreciated. Most of the P-40s seen restored at air shows and museums are the Kitty Hawk models, as most of the P-40B, Cs, and Ds did not survive the war or the melting pot at the close of hostilities. This Curtiss shown flying over Chino, California belongs to the Planes of Fame Museum and is being flown by Johnny Maloney, son of the museum's owner and founder, Ed Maloney. Those of us who live in Southern California have the rare opportunity of viewing firsthand a real live flying Mitsubishi Type O, or as it's better known, the Zero. This aircraft was restored by personnel at the Planes of Fame Museum in Chino, California. It is the only flying Zero in the world. The Zeros that the Tigers encountered over Rangoon in 1941 and 1942 were 011s or A6M2s. This aircraft had a 950 horsepower Nakajima Sakai 12 engine. 64 were built of this particular model. Compared to the P-40s, the Zero had a top speed of 331 miles per hour and could rapidly climb to over 33,000 feet. Armament consisted of 2 20-millimeter cannon in the wings and 2 7.7-millimeter guns in the cowl. What did you think about the way Chenault controlled his pilots over there?
Well, his basic philosophy, of course, was that we were flying with the P-40s. Our airplane was much heavier and couldn't turn with the Japanese fighters, and so the only thing we could do would be to try to get a shot at them, and if they got behind us and in a position to shoot at us, we had to dive for the ground. Well, this made sense because our airplanes were heavier and they were a little bit faster in the dive, so we could get away if somebody was on our tail.
Early in January of 1942, the first Mitsubishi Type O Japanese Navy fighters started to appear over Rangoon. These were the dreaded Zero aircraft of Pearl Harbor infamy. The newest fear was, can the Tigers still maintain their low loss ratio while fighting the latest Japanese fighter, piloted by combat experienced flyers? Colonel Chenault also feared this new challenge, and even more intense ground training resumed. Detailed diagrams were entrusted to memory, such as where the Zero was most vulnerable, how the Zero pilot thought and reacted under fire. Chenault drilled all these facts and figures and more into his men at every opportunity. And it worked. The Zeros arrived in numbers, and the toll exacted by the Tigers on the enemy planes continued to mount, with very few losses to AVG ships or personnel. And to keep down pilots from being mistaken for enemy and shot on sight, a blood chit was affixed to the back of their flying jackets, consisting of a Chinese national flag and the wording in Chinese, "I am an aviator fighting for China against the Japanese. Please take me to the nearest communication agency." Throughout the next 6 months, the Tigers fought so gallantly for China that Madam Chiang Kai-shek made several visits to the bases to thank the men personally for their unselfish devotion to their adopted country. The Tigers fought hard, and the Chinese people were very appreciative. But the driving force behind the Tigers was, without a doubt, Claire Chennault. The Tigers' victory were his proof that the tactics that he had proposed in his controversial book, The Role of Defensive Pursuit, were valid. He and his Tigers were the true heroes of their day. When their contract ended on July 3rd, 1942, the American volunteer group Flying Tigers had amassed an impressive record which to this day has never been equaled. Between December 18, 1941 and July 4, 1942, the group was officially credited by the Chinese government with the destruction of 299 Japanese aircraft, the number by which the Chinese computed the $500 per plane bonus to the deserving pilot. And some say that the jungle, mountains, and bodies of water in the area hold at least 300 more downed enemy aircraft, which were never confirmed. Another rumor circulated, and was undoubtedly true, that Colonel Claire Chennault personally downed over 30 Japanese aircraft, which he declined to acknowledge. The aircraft of the China Air Task Force consisted of only 54 P-40s from the Tigers, and the conditions were practically the same as with the AVG. Never enough supplies, not enough trained ground personnel. The pilots often had to service their own ships with ammunition and fuel. Many of their days started before 3 a.m. and ended after midnight, with many pilots flying as many as 5 combat missions a day. Chennault used every aviation tactic in the book, then invented some of his own. He substituted different numbers on the aircraft, changed the color of the spinners, and always attacked from a different direction each time. These tactics so confused the Japanese that they believed he had over 200 fighters in his command, rather than the paltry 29 which were operational at any one time. Chennault only wished that he had the 200 top fighter planes that the Japanese believed he did. Chennault may not have had the planes he needed, but he had the top quality personnel to advise and assist him in the running of the CATF. Colonel Marion C. Cooper, a World War I airman and the veteran Hollywood creator of the movie King Kong, and Colonel Robert Lee Scott, Jr. Cooper served as Chennault's administrative assistant and Scott as flight operations officer. Scott later went on to recount his exploits in his now famous book, God is My Co-Pilot. Colonel Scott received the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Air Medal, and the World War II Victory Medal, among others, for his courageous actions with Chennault in China. As the fighting drew to a close, Washington carried out a reorganization of the China forces, and rather than shift his headquarters to Chengdu, an unimportant area of operations, Chennault submitted a request for retirement and boarded a departing C-47 on August 8, 1945, only 2 days after the Hiroshima raid. Without explanation, Claire Chennault, who was probably the single most valiant fighter in the war against Japan, was not among those present on the deck of the battleship USS Missouri when Japan formally surrendered.
Okay, I'm Tex Hill. I was in the 2nd Squadron in the American Volunteer Group. I later became squadron leader of that group, and we were known as the Panda Bears. I heard you ask Rotowall a while ago about the equipment, about the P-40, and for our environment, it was a fine weapon system used properly. They had the same kind of equipment down in the Pacific when the war broke out, and they didn't come off too well against the Japanese. And that was because it wasn't used properly. But in other areas, the P-40 probably was pretty doggy. The way a lot of people used the airplane, the way they were trained in the classical dogfight, where you'd get up and try to turn inside of another airplane and get on his tail, and you couldn't do that. We had to use a hit-and-run deal. We'd have to slip up behind one and try to get him. And if he got on our tail, then we could dive out. We'd dive dive out and we could get away from them. We couldn't turn inside of them, and if we tried to, they'd be on our tail immediately. So then we'd just dive out and come on back up. But we used a two-ship element, which Chenault had designed this tactic, and with the two-ship element, it meant that we could catch single out one Japanese, and as we closed on him, why, he would pull it into a steep turn, and the lead guy could not pull enough deflection on him, but the wingman could come back and give a wide angle, get a wide angle on him, and was able to get him. First mission that I was on was a mission over in TAC, over in Thailand, and the first two airplanes I shot down were over there. There were four of us that went out. Newkirk was leading. I was flying his wing. Jim Howard was leading the second element. Bert Christman was flying on his wing. Christman turned back. The three of us proceeded onto the target, not expecting to encounter any Japanese opposition. But the Japanese were up, and we didn't see them. They were above us. And the first thing I noticed, there were more than three of us in the pattern. Well, we were down strafing the field, and so I said the first thing I noticed, there were more than three of us in the pattern. This guy was on Jim Howard's tail, and which I shot him down. And then a guy made an overhead pass on me and shot 33 holes in my plane. And then another one came in head on, and I was able to get him. The bullets stuck in the prop that didn't come through. They had small caliber guns in these I-97s, which were the first two aircraft that I shot down. And it threw the prop out of balance and just about came out of the airplane. Finally made it back to base. When I left the AVG, our group broke up in July of '42. There were 5 pilots and about 20 ground personnel that took spot appointments or assignments into the Army Air Corps. And I took a spot commission as a major, became a squadron commander of the 75th Fighter Squadron, which was one of the elements of the 23rd Fighter Group.
I'm Bob Scott. I was a regular colonel in the Air Force, and the Lord took me by the hand and took me to Kunming to meet General Chenault and the Flying Tigers, and they let me fly with them and taught me enough to someday be their leader. When July the 4th came, 1942, and they were inducted into the regular establishment, I happened to be at the right place at the right time and became the first group commander of the 23rd. Well, the best thing about the Burma Road, I remembered, the way I got to China was telling a lie that I'd flown a B-17. I'd never been in one because I was 33 years old and they said it was too old to be a fighter pilot. So I got the opportunity to tell the lie that I'd flown the B-17, and I got to China with it, and I met General Chenault one day at Loy Wing, Burma. And he wanted me off the field at first because the Air Force, or the Army Air Corps then, had been sending him the wrong equipment. And I dumped out all the wrong equipment, GI cans, mop handles, brooms, and filing cabinets, and it put in 16 drums of 100-octane gasoline. On top of each drum, a 50-caliber box of 50-caliber ammunition and 500-pound bombs. I thought General Chenault would run out to me and say, "Thank God you're here, Scott," but instead of that he said, "Get the hell off the field. Tex Hill is up there with a squadron waiting for the Japanese to come in, and this is the first thing they'll get." And I yelled at Sergeant Altonen, "Open the doors and show him what we've got." And he could see those rusty drums, and he said, "Well, cover it with bamboo, those wings." And when he turned away, I jumped in the slit trench where he was talking to Tex Hill on radio. And I said, "Sir, I'm really a fighter pilot." And he said, "Son, you're in the wrong uniform, and look at the insignia on that airplane. It's a Chinese insignia." There was one lone P-40 sitting out on the runway, which wasn't much of a runway then. It was pierced steel plank, they called PSP. And I grabbed General Chenault by the elbow and I said, "Sir, I know you find me flying this Goonie bird, but I'm really a fighter pilot." And he, with a withering look, he said, "I never saw a colonel who was a fighter pilot. You're too high-ranking. And look at the insignia on that airplane. It's a Chinese insignia." Well, something made me say the right thing. I said, "General, I thought you wanted any man who wanted to fight to be here and fly your airplanes. And he said, all right, but you better hurry and get that airplane off the field because the Japanese will be here in 5 minutes. Everything started perfectly. And you had to do a lot of things to start a P-40, work a wobble pump, have a bunch of, hit it 6 times with a primer and such as that. But it started just like a divine hand that helped me, which I kind of think it had. And I swung out and took off. And I'd like to tell you that I shot my first airplane down that day, but I never saw Tex Hill and the Flying Tigers. I never found the Japs. And there were no maps in the airplane. I even got lost. But I saw the crookedest road I'd ever seen in my life. And I heard that the Burma Road makes 10,000 hairpin turns from Rangoon to Kunming. And I followed that road back and forth till I came to a field that I thought I had taken off from. And there down below was 6 airplanes parked with a gap in between them and another 6. And a man walking anxiously between those places. And it was General Chenault. I landed, he motioned me into the place, parked me, and then he said, how in the world did you start that airplane? That's what we call the hangar queen. But later on, General Chenault sent a man who's right here today, Bob Lair, with a new P-40 to me, loaned it to me at Dinjan, and that's how I got to really meet the Flying Tigers. I flew guest missions with them. They taught me how to fly General Chenault's way, and when July the 4th came, 1942, I was in the right place at the right time to get the greatest job in the world, the command of the 23rd Fighter Group. The story I know about Tex is the first real combat I ever got in was over Hong Kong, and what better wingman could you have had than Tex Hill? First of all, I'd just been appointed the group commander, and we over Hong Kong at 18,000 feet with 7 P-40s escorting 12 B-25s in to hit a Japanese task force that thank God wasn't there. Otherwise, we'd all been shot down. And all of a sudden, we noticed a bunch of flashes emanating from Kai Tak Airdrome, a Jap airdrome. And we began to count them, and I hear Tex say that 24 of them. All I thought about was going down for these zeros. Sure, we got 7 P-40s against 24 zeros. We're going to all die anyway. So I just nosed the airplane down. That isn't the way you do it. I saw something going to my wing with 155 on it, and Tex had split S, which meant he was going about 500 miles an hour before I could have gone 300 miles an hour. Now, you would say right away 7 against 24 is pretty bad. Well, we shot down 19 that day. We really lost the battle because we lost 2 of our men. That's the kind of war we fought. Just think of representing the greatest country in the world with 7 airplanes.